I would like to explain some ground rules. So welcome to the bars again. The ground rules of the seminar are relatively straightforward. We promised Chris that he can go for 15 minutes uninterrupted. And in the meantime, we will be taking questions in the chat. So please feel free to use the chat for questions. You can also have the occasional hello and everything. That's also fine. But in your question, you can also indicate that maybe you don't want to ask this question yourself, but you rather just want to give some background information for Chris to look into later, or if you want to just give a command that doesn't require Chris to answer, you can also, of course, indicate. So if you want Chris to answer, you don't have to do anything. So we will try to combine the questions if necessary, but we will call on you after the 15 minutes are done. And then after Chris answered to all your questions, he can continue, and he will continue. And then we will take questions as they come, basically. So maybe roughly every 15 minutes. But I will also, Chris, allow myself to step in and interrupt you at any time if I feel that it's useful. Okay? Okay, Chris?
Perfect.
Perfect. Wonderful. So I just remember that I should also introduce Chris Chapman to everybody. Chris Chapman is a well-known, extremely well-known accounting scholar with a broad interest, but most of the stuff that Chris is doing is related to management accounting, and he's now with the University of Bristol, as you can also see from his slide deck. And I think, so I already told you that this is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, just shut off your video and your mic, and nothing bad will happen to you. If you speak up, then you might end up on the ASC webpage. Yeah, this should be it. So Chris, floor is yours. We're looking forward to your talk. We're excited to have you.
Thanks very much, Joachim, for the introduction. And thank you to all the organizers of VARS for setting this up. I think it's a really fantastic opportunity. So thank you also everyone who's giving up their time on a Friday afternoon to listen to me ramble about control or seduction, gamification at Foursquare. So this is a paper that Wai-Fong and Tanya and I have been working on for a while. We're kind of, we think we've almost come up with a response to the review comments we got. So we're going to kind of test drive. This is, if you like, version 2. Our first version was very open, a bit unfocused, and the reviewers kind of came up with some helpful suggestions about how we could add some focus, and also some, fairly pointed direction about the need to do so. So we'll see how we've done as I go through it. In terms of oops, sorry, let me get my screen going. In terms of going up, I thought I'd start with just a little bit of a preamble, because the paper starts, bang, here we go. But given this is a really broad audience, and we've got probably people from all sorts of areas, I thought it might be helpful just to spend a little bit of time situating just a little broader. And I guess, if you like, the overarching issue that we're interested in and got us motivated to try and write something up and study something is this idea that technology transforms power and control. What the nature of technology is really matters. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this wonderful book by Denise Schmont-Besserat, who's a Belgian archaeologist. And she was digging around in the desert, and she kept on finding all these clay tokens. And she was wondering, what on earth is this? And to start with, she thought maybe they were pieces for a game or something. And it turns out that they were an early accounting system. And so she traced, therefore, through the archaeological record what was going on. And it turns out that the accounting system was the precursor to writing. So cuneiform writing basically emerges out of this accounting system. And so I'm just briefly, because I think it's just interesting for accountants to know that, wow, we are really cool. The city-state and writing owe their existence to us. That's not a bad place to be on a Friday afternoon. Is these tokens. And in the development of the system, basically, Schmont-Besserat charts the move from basically really quite physical to quite abstract in terms of how we represent things. And so in the early days, basically these tokens, they were modeled in clay, and there were various geometric forms. So you had spheres, you had cubes, you had cones. And if you like, they represented a quantity of a valuable commodity. So wheat, olive oil, beer, whatever it was. And so they were a way of counting how much stuff you had. And as you become a city, it's big enough that you actually need a system to keep track of who's where and what's around. But over time, effectively, the city got more complicated. And the kind of short story is they ran out of shapes. Because, of course, as society gets more complicated and you have more than just basic commodities, you start to have manufactured commodities. If you're just going for a simple representation of shape equals commodity, at some point you run out of, if you like, tractably manufacturable shapes. And so they started to take the basic shapes and modify them by drawing lines on them. So if you like, you have a cone, but you could have an unadorned cone, or you could have a cone with vertical lines, or you have a cone with horizontal lines. And this is a way of, if you like, proliferating the number of things that you can deal with. But as they were doing this, they also started to realize that actually having all these tokens was kind of unwieldy because you have to store them. And so a technological development they made was the idea that actually we don't need the token. If we roll out a piece of clay flat, we make a kind of clay piece of paper and we can press the shape into the clay piece of paper and have an impression of a shape. And actually, it's more convenient to have a piece of clay with lots of impressions on it than lots of physical tokens. But of course, this worked well when you were dealing with simple shapes, but as you start to incise the shapes, they don't make an impression neatly. And so you start to feel there's a problem about how you do this, and so the technology evolves again. And as they're doing this, they're also thinking, well, you know what? Instead of making 10 impressions to say I've got 10 things, maybe I could have a symbol for 10. And so we start to see abstraction in representation. It's getting less and less literal, more and more abstract. And so cuneiform writing, and there's my little picture up here, this simple system of pushing tokens into pieces of clay reduced exercise where you have a stylus with an isosceles triangle, and then it's very easy for the person doing the impressions to poke things in, but also to rotate it to create different shapes and combinations of impressions. And so that's where cuneiform comes out of. So it's all coming out of this early accounting system. And of course, the important point for our paper here is that, of course, this means that if you know how the counting works and the writing works, this puts you in a pretty good position. And so, you know, this early point, technology transforms power and control. Yeah, it's pretty old news. As I say, bound to about 8,000 BC there. But of course, technology moves on. And just because I'm indulging myself on a Friday afternoon, I love this picture. And I don't know how many people know Joanne Yates' lovely book, Control Through Communication. But she's talking about the emergence of kind of the large organization in the States and what was going on. And I think a good representation of that is this lovely picture of the DuPont company's chart room. And so, you know, they're not using clay tablets. They've got nice graphs, lots of data. We can imagine DuPont's a large organization with lots of operating divisions, and we've got graphs and we've got reports. But of course, how do you access all this data? And so then they invent this lovely ceiling mounted rack system whereby you can flip the charts around and you can see the senior executives here would have been sitting there surveying their organization through the data. And so that's a kind of technology evolves. And of course, now enough indulgence. Today, of course, today we're in a world of big data. And I found this infographic from Forbes last summer. And this is the amount of data collected on various platforms every single minute of every day in the United States only. So you can see, for example, that there are 4.5 million YouTube views every minute of every day in the United States. And that was last year. So you can imagine it's probably bigger now. And then, of course, there's lots of other platforms, Google, Giphy, Netflix. So in some senses, we've gone from clay tokens to ceiling mounted racks of charts to big data, which is big in sort of almost unimaginable ways. And when we think about big, it's become big in a number of ways. And so in the big data world, people normally go back to Gartner and their 3 V's: volume, velocity, and variety. And so we say, well, look, there's a lot of it, but it's coming much faster. You don't get an update every day or every month. You get an update maybe every second. And so there's a considerably sort of faster flow increasing the volume, but also variety. It's not just numbers, it's not just charts, it's audio files, it's video clips, it's geotagged location data on things. There's lots of different forms of data now as that proliferates. And that was 2001, so I can't remember what they're up to. I think it's at least 9 V's now. So, you know, they've decided big data is really big in lots of ways. That's not really our purpose here. what got us interested about this is that when we look at all of this data and how this is going on, part of the reason why it's there is because, if you like, our daily lives are increasingly mediated by technology. We just do things through technology. I was in the States on holiday last year, and I hadn't come across this before, but I went to Starbucks, and I suddenly realized that lots of people don't order their coffee at the Starbucks anymore. They order their coffee on an app in advance and then drive to the Starbucks to pick it up. So even the job of getting a cup of coffee is now technologically mediated potentially. And so everything, it's not just work anymore, it's everything. And this is really partly because of all of this growth in social media and platform organizations. So YouTube, Instagram, but also things like TripAdvisor. You know, the process of finding a hotel for your holiday is something we would now do on our computers or our phones. And so this is where data is, this is where technology is. And we thought, well, an aspect of these platforms that seems distinctive is that they're starting to use something called gamification. Yeah, and gamification is about the application of game design elements in non-game settings. So it's something that's going on. It's a way in which technology is being mobilized. And we thought this is going to be interesting to explore. So I've used up 10 minutes of my 15 minutes of uninterruption, but I wanted to give that kind of opening preamble about this is the kind of general arena that we're wanting to play in. And then we get to the actual paper. And so the actual paper, and I think probably the first sentence of the paper says probably something very much like this. And that's why I wanted to give a bit of a preamble for those of you who are less invested in our particular areas of the literature. We have this idea of a post-disciplinary accounting research. And again, that may be a concept or a term that people aren't familiar with. In this case, post-disciplinary is a reference to the work of Michel Foucault and his concept of disciplinary control. So the idea is, well, there was disciplinary control and then there is something else. And so people have moved on from discipline, they're moving into these kind of post-disciplinary conceptions. And very much sort of people who are writing and who are concerned about things like neoliberalism and the fact that we're starting to make work in life. You know, we're trying to create entrepreneurs of the self, not just in the office, but everywhere. And so there's a concern that actually you see technology creating possibilities to do these kinds of things, to transform the nature of life, make it more stressful, change identity. And this is the kind of the jumping off point, because by and large, when we look at the control literature, the most common resonance we have is that by and large, people find being controlled stressful. Yeah, so as you start to try and control them in all aspects of their lives, this seems like it might be slightly worrying. And this is kind of provocative in relation to gamification, because at least in aspiration, the whole point of games is to have fun. And so that seems like an interesting contrast to look at. I mean, if control is normally generating stress, but this is a way of thinking about how we control people by having fun, what does that look like? And so we undertook what we're calling a netnography. It's a term that's sort of getting increasing use. And I know Ingrid and Chris are in the audience out there somewhere. They were some of the pioneers in adopting this approach methodologically. So there's basically a lot of material out there online as documents that we can access. And so we thought, well, let's look at what's going on in that to understand Foursquare. And Foursquare, again, for those of you who may not use Foursquare or have heard of it, it's a very significant social media platform. And I guess they very much see gamification as a core part of how they work. And so it seemed like an interesting setting to explore. And theoretically, having said, you know, post-disciplinary, in Foucault's terms, he has two big games in town, I guess, when he's thinking about discipline and then he's thinking about biopower. And these things operate at different levels, and that's part of the interest, is that biopower is a very much a population level effect. It's not about containing the individual, and particularly the individual's body, but it's about understanding populations and how we can control through that. And he contrasts it a lot with discipline. And so whereas discipline is really all about enclosure, you know, and Ingrid, I know you're out there, you know, you've done a lot of interesting work looking at standard body sizes and what's going on in these areas to contain and control and shape the body. That's very much a disciplinary concern. Biopower is at the milieu level, and it's, as opposed to containing, it's supposed to be pushing out. And there's a part of this idea that, well, actually, as we start to think about the population, more opportunities start to strike us for ways in which we control, and we start to attach to different aspects of what's going on. which of course is why the neoliberal analysis makes a lot of sense, because that's what they're worried about. The fact that you might have in individual work settings people being controlled, but suddenly we have a neoliberal agenda that's trying to control and transform the population at the level of the population in all aspects of its life. And so we're interested in exploring that. But what we do is we try and bring in this aspect of seduction to understand, what does fun do in this? Because by and large, the biopower and the discipline are rarely thought to be about the kind of more positive, the more fun sides. They're more about this. And this is kind of a provocative leap to draw in Baudrillard, because Baudrillard and Foucault were, I guess you would say, not best friends. So the core piece of writing that we're going to draw on to try and theorize seduction as something we can use to complement Foucault was actually submitted by Baudrillard to a journal that at the time Foucault was editing. And the title of the piece was "Forget Foucault." So it was an extreme direct and quite strong attack on Foucault's analysis of power, saying, no, this is all nonsense, you've got it completely wrong. And so we're going to try and say, well, actually, in some ways, when we look onwards in the literature, a lot of people have looked back at Baudrillard and said, well, yeah, we see what you're saying about Foucault, but in some senses, you've made the same mistake. You've just made it, if you like, mirrored in terms of your areas of attention. And that's why we think there's the potential for these two to be actually, if you like, complementary, as opposed to just starkly argued as they emerged in the literature, at least. And we think it answers Baudrillard's problem, which he had with Foucault, which his basic problem was, but if this really is the nature of control, where it is power, and it's rather unilateral because someone controls someone else, how does that actually sustain itself? Surely there has to be something else at stake that draws people into it. And particularly once we start to think at the level of biopower, what is it that enables this thing to spread outwards? And so that's the kind of gap we think that Baudrillard saw in Foucault's work, but actually we think rather than replacing Foucault, he can complement the ideas of biopower useful to structure what's going on in this seductive setting. And so he brings in very much this idea of soft seduction. And the term here is important to distinguish, because sometimes when we think about seduction, it can seem rather unilateral. We have a notion of dominance. I seduce you into doing what I want you to do. Yeah, and so his notion of soft seduction, what he's really trying to get into is a situation where things are more in exchange, more reversible. It's not that one person is per se always in charge. The other person is giving, yeah, and is choosing to give as much as they are being controlled. And so this is the aspect of seduction that we want to bring out. And it, we hope, makes sense in terms of what it seems that Foursquare is doing.
Okay, Chris. Oh, you have another bullet point. Do the other bullet point, and then I chime in.
I was going to say, yeah. Then I've reached my my opening pasture, and we can jump in. And so the argument we're going to make in relation to Foursquare is that users play in a gamified milieu, expanding their own activity and enlarging the community. So we're trying to speak to this centrifugal. How is things pushing outwards? And in doing so, it's not all fun, though. And this is kind of the, if you like, the bit why Foucault is still relevant, because Baudrillard really critiques Foucault for over-focusing on the material and production and says, no, the symbolic is what's important. But actually, when we look in Foursquare, what we find is that, yes, it is the symbolic nature of the interactions in the Foursquare milieu that encourage users to do these things. But that's only because Foursquare has very carefully set things up so the commodity exchange that's going on is, if you like, somewhat hidden in the background. And so the material is still a very important part of what's going on, but the symbolic is given a more direct play. So maybe that's a good point for me to pause, take a breath, and no doubt I will have queued up some puzzlement, and let's see how we go.
Okay, wonderful. So we have a first question here from Miming Shi. Miming, would you unmute yourself and just ask the question if you like?
Oh, thank you. It just came to me, the control, just mentioned, Chris just mentioned the control is for fun. Instead of, to me, my understanding is traditional control is try to control, for example, your organization to achieve the goals. And if control for fun, I guess I don't know, probably Chris have some explanation on this.
No, I think that's a really important point. And in some senses, it's the point I rushed over to get to the question, but I'm sure everyone else in the audience was also wondering the same thing. And so the point about play is there is, if you like, a symbolic world in which Foursquare users interact with each other. And it's all about badges and tokens and mayorships and sort of community. But as they are doing that, what they are doing is effectively laboring to produce data. When they check in somewhere, it's data for Foursquare. And this is where, if you like, the control element comes in, because actually Foursquare is not doing this out of the goodness of its heart. It's not creating a gamified media so that people can have fun directly. It's by having fun, people produce data. And the data is what Foursquare uses to sell to third parties in order to actually make money. And so that's what we think brings this into the realm of control as we more traditionally understand it, because whilst it's, if you like, people having fun, it's people having fun in ways that produces data that Foursquare sells. Okay. So effectively, they are unpaid laborers from that perspective.
Thank you. I guess that's your explanation. It's add the perspective to control. I guess it's make the control more rich.
Yes, and that is exactly the point, is to say, well, our traditional notions of control tend to be about control producing anxiety and stress and coercion, and someone's in charge. And so are there possibilities for understanding this kind of more seductive notion of control? And whilst we're exploring it, of course, in Foursquare, which is a highly unusual setting, if you like, and Foursquare is in fact somewhat different even from other platform organizations.
I guess that's probably bring out quite interesting perspective about control. Probably you can understand the control at different level. For example, if traditional control, we trying to achieve the goals, and they have different. Yeah, thanks. Very interesting.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, and exactly, you hit on exactly what we are aspiring to achieve. So I'm encouraged that you're prepared to let me carry on talking and see if we can elaborate that more.
No, I won't let this happen, Chris. Sorry, Joachim here, because we also have other questions lined up. But I want to just briefly squeeze in and apologize because I haven't read my Foucault lately. So, but I'm relatively sure that I'm not the only one. So this is why I'm trying to translate the terminology that you use to terminology that I'm more familiar with. And I also know the term control. And my feeling is when you started with the big data intro, that control in today's world where data is the asset that everybody trades gets a somewhat different notion anyway, even without gamification. So I'm tempted to say that maybe Google controls me, but it's not via the traditional ways of how control is being designed. So just wondering whether you could think about this as a continuum from, let's say, typical hierarchical control that you would have with rules and regulations over to, let's say, demand supply control, the data market, if you think, to the, let's say, incentivized gamification control. Would this be a completely stupid idea, or is this something that you have in mind?
No, I mean, we're not specifically articulating it out in this paper, but in some senses, it's necessary for us to imagine there's that possibility that, if you like, we are, as the previous kind of person asked, we're trying to give a different perspective on what control is doing, but ideally not in the sense of just this is really weird thing that goes on only here. And so, if you like, an intellectual connection between these things is a part of what's going on, but we feel we've got enough work to do in elaborating this new form of control that we haven't sketched out in this paper too much of that background. We're going to sketch out a little bit of it in some of the slides that are coming. But so no, I don't think it's at all it's something that actually probably we should go through the discipline of making ourselves think through a bit more explicitly anyway, even if we don't necessarily think the space for it in this paper.
Okay, thanks. Then we have a very interesting question that was asked by two people independently, by Charles and Marco. If I get the chat correctly, then you guys settled that Charles will ask the question. So Charles, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Thanks, Marco, for letting me, and Chris, great to see you here. It's been a while.
Hey, Charles.
Yeah, Marco had asked just a minute before I asked. I think it helps, I think at least me and him and maybe other people to put in the context the meaning of gamification. Let's say today, we all know, we're all working from home, at least in our profession, I think most of us. So there's a lot of controversy around control issues, professional roles from the employer. like as academics, I say we have maybe more freedom naturally, but from corporate employees, you hear a lot of issues and concerns about, yes, I'm free to work on my own, on my home, but at the end of the day, you're very highly controlled. So how does that gamification relate to today's kind of environment as an example, or does it have anything to do with it?
Something I actually just this morning put back in the introduction of the paper that had got dropped, which I think is useful and hopefully maybe helps to address exactly this question, is when we think about gamification, when we're going to look in the field material, we're going to see it uses control practices that we're quite familiar with. Performance evaluation, league tables, classifications. So these are control practices that we're quite used to. What, if you like, makes a gamified control strategy is the intention to generate fun. And I guess, if you like, teleworking, I don't think many people would imagine that the most instances of teleworking are designed to elicit fun. We have performance evaluation, we have stars, we have targets, but this is more traditional notions of control. They just happen to be technologically initiated. So I think, if you like, it's the technology can be mobilized in a number of ways. It can be mobilized in more traditional ways, and indeed is doing so. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the early literature that started to look at sort of what's going on in a lot of these platform review organizations like TripAdvisor or Airbnb, where notionally it's about leisure, and notionally it's about giving evaluations of services that other people might want to, if you like, participate in. But a lot of the emerging research is showing the fact that these platforms are actually acting in many ways in a disciplinary fashion, and people are actually nervous about their presentation of self. And so when they give a review, it's not just a review saying, I think this is a good restaurant. And I think Airbnb is almost infamous in relation to this, in terms of creating a positive story. So Airbnb is not happy when people give negative reviews, and members of the community also worry. And I think you see this a little bit maybe with Uber. The point is that you review the driver and the driver reviews you. But when you're giving the review, therefore, it's not just about, do I think they did a good job? It's also about, is there a danger that I'm going to come across as someone who gives bad reviews, and I'm going to find it more difficult to pick up rides in future on both sides of that. And so we see lots of possibilities for technology and social media to create what we can understand more traditionally as disciplinary, more traditional control type settings. So it's the fact that it's social media and online doesn't automatically make it gamification. Gamification is, if you like, to us, it seems the magic ingredient has to be about whether it's fun. If it's just about using performance ranking to encourage people to work harder, that seems to be much more like the traditional control we already think we know.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have another question, and I just record that I should say first and last name of the person who asked the question, because we have several charts, and we also have several Davids in the room, and this is David Smith. And David Smith has a question. We take that question, and then we give Chris the chance to move on, I guess. David.
Hi, Chris. Just in terms of the discussion so far, it's been really much around framing control as a negative exercise, I suppose, as something that breeds anxiety. So I was wondering, what about the role of control in the more positive sense, in terms of empowering employees, etc., but more significantly in terms of motivating employees to undertake tasks to achieve rewards? Is the use of reward systems in that way not also a form of seduction in a sense?
I think it is, but I would tend to think it's more a form of what Baudrillard would call more radical or hard seduction. Because, you know, and I think Weifong and Christina Bodke's paper is an interesting example in that sense, and that, you know, they're one of the early papers that's bringing out emotions.
Yes.
But in some senses, it's very much about senior management persuading other people to just get on board and kill themselves working overtime to deliver a target. And so, you know, it seems like there's an element of stress in there. It seems the fun element is more muted. And so to me, this looks, if you like, a slightly more kind of control type aspect. I think I don't think it would be considered as a game. And when we get in there intellectually, I guess what we're going to find when we dig into the kind of setting in Foursquare is that it's what makes Foursquare, if you like, able to maintain the more fun element is that it's by creating, if you like, a separate circuit of material exchanges from symbolic exchanges the stakes in the symbolic exchanges are kept somewhat low. And so it leaves more space for fun and spontaneity. But also, I think, in terms of if you like, the nature of Foursquare's interests, because Foursquare's interest is largely in just the production and generation of activity, it doesn't really mind what the user does. You know, it doesn't matter whether users choose to check into museums or restaurants, you know, and in an extreme example we have in the paper, a ditch, because it's about are they having fun enough to continue to engage people in the community and do things. And then whatever they do, Foursquare can sell it to someone. And I think that's very different from the organization in Bert Cruncher.
Great, thank you.
No, thanks for the question.
So thanks, Chris, you continue. And in the meantime, please, by all means, ask questions in the chat for the next round. Thank you.
Okay, and sorry, quickly, I just, because I had to take a quick look, I can see Leona had a question there, so I don't know if I'm allowed to pick questions of my own. But yeah, no. The example I gave of ordering a coffee in Starbucks wasn't supposed to be an example of gamification. It was supposed to be about that our lives are becoming more technologically mediated. And then the argument, as we've just unpacked it in the conversations here, is that, but of course, we can mediate our life in ways that might be more controlling or more playful. And it's opening up the possibilities for understanding that the playful bit is where we're trying to focus. So, Leona, I hope that gives you a kind of more or less answer, or maybe you've gone, I'm not sure. So I'll carry on.
Thank you.
Sure. And so in terms of kind of situating ourselves in the literature, and again, you know, we're obviously choosing to focus on particular bits of the literature, but in this case, we're going to look at some of the work on sort of gamified control practices, which look like the use of stars, rankings, kind of badges, encouraging people to engage with the platform, because, you know, they actually do need to persuade people that this is something they want to spend their time doing. But I think what we see is at least a strand in the literature where people are bringing out the fact that these platforms are, if you like, creating fields of visibility. And people are feeling themselves to be subjected to a field of visibility where they will be judged by the kind of thing they say and how they say it. And so we start to see something that would be look much more traditionally like a disciplinary form of control, where individuals act to normalize themselves. And so this, we think, you know, what we see in the literature by and large is much more on these platform organizations in that form. And so, Jochen, in terms of your not being up on your reading on Foucault, fear not. I am going to do Foucault the massive injustice of trying to give you a whistle-stop tour in one slide. And I guess where we start from is the fact that what Foucault was trying to do was trying to move on how people thought about power. And he's making an opposition. So we start with the idea that if you go back in history, kind of early notions of power in a more feudal society were actually kind of rather blunt. You know, the king could basically kill you, or the barons could basically kill you. And so power used to be about the right to destroy life. And his argument is that, but actually, as things progress and we don't all just go around killing each other anymore, we exist in societies that kind of average or everyday violence is less familiar, we hope. We see a new form of power emerging. And he describes this as the power to make live. So not the getting rid of life, but actually making live, and making live in the sense of fostering certain kinds of life. So his argument is this is a more subtle and powerful form of control than simply being able to take someone's life away. You can make them live your life in a way that you find useful. And this is where we start to see the link into the kind of productivist tendency of what we're trying to do with control. And he starts very much with this notion of disciplinary power. And so I've got a little picture of the panopticon, his fabled prison that he was so interested by. And the argument sort of being made is that it's actually much cheaper not to guard prisoners. It's much cheaper if the prisoners think they're being watched and therefore guard themselves, would be the kind of very quick paraphrase. And so by looking at people, and so in his title in English, it's discipline and punish. In the original French, it's surveiller. It's all about visibility. By making people visible in certain ways, I can encourage them to take upon themselves the task of making them into what I want them to be. And so this idea of I can make them live by creating these fields of visibility. And we've got lots of interesting literature. And I think, you know, one of the ones that I find interesting, and I don't know who is out there, but for our, you know, our colleagues in the more capital markets end of the research, I think John Roberts has a lovely paper in AOS called In the Mirror of the Markets. And he and colleagues are kind of looking at what goes on in investor relations meetings. And this is an interesting setting because notionally, of course, we know they're not about the provision of price-sensitive information because they're not allowed to be. So Roberts and colleagues are kind of asking themselves, so what are these people doing when finance directors go out and talk to analysts about what's going on in the organization? And, you know, the classic story is that it's about allowing the management team to kind of express its competence and find out what the stakeholders want, and the analysts like it because they get to see and judge what's going on in terms of the quality of the management team. And there's that story, but Roberts and colleagues draw out, if you like, the disciplinary potential of that kind of visibility. And so I think, you know, what's really fascinating for me is they tease out the fact of how nervous the finance directors are about these moments of exposure and the stage management and the degree to which they control or wish to control the nature of the questions, because they are very worried about looking foolish. And so they don't want to engage in a dialogue because they don't know what the dialogue's going to look like. They want to engage in a careful presentation of self. And in the paper, one of my favorite bits of the paper is there's a short interview quote from one particular CFO, and the CFO is worried about whether they should shave their beard off. And this is very Foucauldian disciplinary embodied. It's about my body. Do I look professional if I have a beard, if I not have a beard? And so this disciplinary power, and I think this is where it goes to the anxiety. Yeah, and so David, in terms of your earlier question, of course, control has a lot of things going on, but as we focus on at least the disciplinary control literature, it is in essence very much focused about producing anxiety, because anxiety is pretty much the vehicle for behavior modification. But that's only part of what Foucault wrote. And this is one of the challenges when you're dealing with kind of interpretive theorists, is kind of people say, oh, I'm using Foucault in my paper. But of course, Foucault wrote many, many books over a couple of decades. And so to say I'm using Foucault is always a massive simplification. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so, you know, whilst the disciplinary control literature in accounting is really very big and rich, I think by now, an important aspect in terms of Foucault's own kind of elaborations and thinking through his problems as he went through giving various lectures, he introduces this notion of biopower as a contrast with disciplinary power. And he's very much thinking at the level of the population. So whereas this is very much about the individual and the body of the individual, this is saying, no, think about the population. How does the population behave? How can I conceptualize it? And whereas this is all about containment, it's all about forcing, in an ideal sense, disciplinary power produces exactly the same in everyone. We are made to live in the way that the power and control sees as being productive for us to live. Biopower is about, no, let me think about the productive force of the population at the level of the population. And so he sees this as, if you like, control spreading out and different aspects of things being connected, and a certain amount of laissez-faire, because of course, I'm interested in the population. So if one or two individuals choose to do some things and other individuals choose to do other things, that's not my primary concern. I'm interested in the population, whereas in a disciplinary context, making sure everyone does the same is exactly the intention. And so he's interested in how can we control a milieu or use a milieu as a way of exerting productive force on a population. And so as we look at this, of course, they're not alternatives. You know, his argument is that in any situation, of course, there will be elements of both, and they have what he calls a complex dovetailing. In some senses, as I start at the population to conceptualize what's going on, it may well be that that spawns new disciplinary apparatuses as I see opportunities to, if you like, nudge the individual in directions that I think are likely to be more productive. But there might also be other things going on at the more population level that don't require that. And I think Christine Cooper's AOS piece on neoliberalism and sort of biopower is, you know, a very nice articulation of this agenda where we see biopower starting to come in, and it's being attached to, whereas these tend to be rather local particular systems of control, this is sort of thinking about the permeation of this kind of mode of control across society. But having said that, then Baudrillard comes along. And as I said, it's somewhat provocatively, his title of his piece that he submitted to Foucault's journal is Forget Foucault. And he says, well, yeah, all this stuff is very nice, but you're missing something important. And so for Baudrillard, when he looks at this kind of Foucauldian story that I've just paraphrased very briefly on the previous slide, he thinks, well, it's kind of unilateral. You know, there is someone in charge and there are people who are being controlled. And he's puzzled a little bit. You know, how does this sustain itself? You know, in some senses, if discipline really works, and I have made people into the thing I want them to be, I've changed themselves, or I've made them change themselves into what I want them to be, then in some sense, I don't need to control them anymore. Because, you know, in an ideal world, I've changed them and now they just do what I want. But equally, if I haven't achieved that level of saturation of changing the subjectivity, why don't they turn around to me and say, this is a terrible idea. Why are we letting you be in charge? And so he raises this kind of slightly different perspective of if the Foucauldian story is the whole story, then how does it sustain itself? So his argument is there's something missing. And what he thinks is missing is this notion of symbolic exchange. So as opposed to what he sees in Foucault as a much more unilateral understanding of power, where someone is in charge and they make someone else do something, he's interested in teasing out the ways in which control is, if you like, played at by both sides. Yeah, there is a contribution. And so understanding why someone might choose to play in a control situation as the person who's not notionally in charge, he wants to draw in much more of these ideas about symbolic exchange. So Foucauldian stuff is much more about the productive and the material. So he's trying to contrast and say, well, there must be something else going on over here. And so he introduces his concept of seduction to say, well, this is something that is a new way of thinking about it that helps us find this. And it's a strategy of displacement to divert from one's path. So in that sense, it's still a form of control because I am doing something. You know, something is being done to the individual, but it's more two-way because it's not I'm diverting them from their path onto the path I specifically want them to be on. We are collectively, because of how we are interacting, moving in a new way. So he wants to bring out these, and he's very keen to say it's not seduction in its what you might call more radical sense, where it is more unilateral again. You know, I seduce you, and therefore you do what I want. You know, and I guess if I was to look at the Bodker and Chua paper, I would see that as a much more radical form of seduction that's going on in their control organization. And he's interested in this seduction in its soft sense, the seduction of an ambiance, a playful eroticization of the universe without stakes. And it's because he's wanting to look at the symbolic more than the material that, if you like, this is how he hopes he can open up a space for a more reversible, a more exchange-driven notion of what's going on. And as you move into a symbolic exchange world, he starts to provide a way for us to understand, well, why would this system of control, if you like, expand? And of course, it's because people are seeking to engage and outdo each other. We create a milieu in which there is, if you like, this playful eroticization, but the point is, therefore, that's no use if it's only me. I need there to be more people involved for the symbolic nature of my achievements or my gratification to actually have any meaning to me. And so I need more people. And so it is expansive, if you like, because of the nature of what's going on. And so it's unsettling identity. So as opposed to make live, with Foucault's idea of I ultimately want to control you in order to foster the kind of life you live, seduction is about exploration and discovery. Yeah, and so it's going to turn out, of course, which is why we want both, is that we think they're complementary. And so, you know, Baudrillard goes too far in the other direction, probably. But this is the kind of rough idea of the theorization that we want to kind of work with by studying Foursquare as a way of analyzing in a concrete setting this kind of theoretical agenda, which for Friday afternoon might be a bit heavy, that I've just been laying out. So, Joachim, are you okay for me to carry on into the method section and then some field material, or are there questions you think it might be good to take now?
No, I think it's good if you continue a little bit into the method section, and then I collect some questions in between, and then we have a round, okay?
Cool, all good. So, heavy theory bit out the way, hopefully. Let's talk a little bit about what we actually did. So Foursquare, and again, for those of you who are not familiar with it, you know, they self-describe as a location technology platform dedicated to improving how people move through the real world. This is kind of slightly weird, but basically this is about checking in. Yeah, it's when you go places. And so there are two user-driven apps. One of them is Foursquare Swarm, One of them is Foursquare City Guide. And so the Swarm app is, and they describe it as allowing their users to produce a life log. Yeah, it's about producing a record of their activity and their achievement. And they achieve by checking in. So when you do something, when you go to Starbucks, you check in and say, I've been to Starbucks. And of course, part of the gamification is that they try and make this into a bit of a game. And so one of the things they do is they have leaderboards. So when you check in, you get points. Yeah, and of course, there's a leaderboard then of, how many points have I got compared to the people I'm competing with, when I've got friends in the app that I'm directly competing with. And of course, they manipulate the point system as well. So checking in on my own is not worth as much to me as checking in with friends. So you get, if you like, a bonus multiplier for certain things. So Foursquare is, and this is where we get to the control element, Foursquare is trying to do things that will generate more data of a more useful kind for it to sell to third parties. But in doing so, it's hopefully creating still, if you like, a somewhat low stakes fun area where individuals hopefully don't get too narcissistically preoccupied. And so part of that is the fact that leaderboards is only part of the story. And so I guess if you think about the nature of what are some of the problems with games, if games produce a clear hierarchy and there are winners and losers, and a leaderboard is a good example of something that might do that. If I'm always checking in and I turn out to be the 20,000th in the ranking of London, I'm going to stop checking in because it's boring if I'm always like nowhere near the medals, so to speak. And so in their environment, they also produce a lot of other ways to win. Yeah, and so you have badges which are rewarded for certain kinds of specific behavior. You also have mayorships. So if you are the person who checks in most at your local coffee shop, you get to be the mayor of your local coffee shop. Yeah, and so there's a whole bunch of symbolic tokens that they create in order to try and motivate people to do things. But the things that they do are hopefully left open to them in terms of, I decide whether it's the coffee shop or the cinema or the restaurant based on the connections that I have, my interests as to whether I like coffee or cinemas, and the friends that I think I can engage with, so I can have this symbolic milieu in which it actually means something beyond my own narcissistic reflection of myself in the leaderboard. It means something in the wider community. So there's Swarm, and there's also City Guide. And if you like, this is a kind of richer version of checking in, because whilst in Swarm, you're checking in and you might upload a photo, or you might say, I checked in with so-and-so. City Guide is when you kind of check in and you provide a more detailed written analysis about the nature of what's going on. And over time, the argument is we construct, if you like, a community understanding about if you're visiting a particular city or location, the Foursquare community is providing you with its tips or its ideas about what's fun or what you might like to do. And we start to have super users. Yeah, so we give people a symbolic reward to be a super user in Swarm because they've put in particularly useful or well appreciated contributions appreciated by other members of the community. And so this is what's going on in terms of the user. And so it is about this creation of a symbolic milieu in which people can do things that create symbolic achievements for themselves. And so over time, in 2019, 13 billion online check-ins. That's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff at more than 105 million venues. And that, of course, is where the money comes from. So enterprise services data is a completely different side of Foursquare, where Foursquare is approaching other service providers, other platform organizations like Uber, and selling and exchanging data in order to basically, hopefully, help them produce a more compelling proposition to persuade Foursquare users to buy their services. But it is that kind of complex triangle. Foursquare doesn't ask its users to pay anything. You don't work for Foursquare, you don't pay Foursquare. It's a symbolic milieu in which you hopefully move through the real world in a way that you feel is more satisfying. But in doing so, you produce data that Foursquare is selling. Yeah, and so in order to kind of analyze this, that's the basic nature of what Foursquare is. We spent quite a long time, of course, looking at various documents, and Foursquare itself produces a lot of material. And it produces material for its users, but it also produces material for its enterprise services. So it's describing the services and the kinds of ways it thinks it can create value for third-party organizations. And so we undertook a fairly lengthy and detailed kind of trawl of all this material to try and produce the field material rundown I'm about to go through. And of course, to start with, we set our pitch quite broadly. And so the first version of the paper, we were also talking about a number of other platform organizations. But as we started to zero on, particularly around this idea of the potential of seduction as a way of theorizing control, we focused in on Foursquare because it's the empirical setting that most clearly allows us to study that kind of thing. So gamification at Foursquare, there's just some pictures. There you are being mayor of your coffee shop. If you're the top of the league table, then you get a piñata. And it's a kind of little fun thing, extra bonus for being at the top. And these badges, doesn't really matter what they are. I went to lots of pizza shops. I checked in at lots of movies. And so I think that the point of these things is that in some ways they look like performance targets, but they're not performance targets because Foursquare doesn't really mind what you do. It just minds that you do things, and it wants to create a symbolic milieu in which you find it fun to do things. And so there are lots of different ways in which you can choose to find yourself successful or choose to reach out to different members of the community. So that's a kind of key part of what's going on. And so they're really trying to create this kind of symbolic exchange and one-upmanship. And that's kind of the point, is that there has to be some degree of competition. If users just do stuff and check in and don't feel compelled to do more or to encourage people, then ultimately that's not great for Foursquare's business model. So they're walking this delicate tightrope about how do I control people by making them labor to produce me data, but keep things low stakes enough that this doesn't become a new source of anxiety where people start to worry about the fact that, oh my gosh, I'm about to lose the mayorship of my coffee shop. This is disaster. I think there's lots of research that shows the potentially sort of dark side of social media where people start to get into more kind of anxious representations of themselves and worry that they're not presenting themselves as a perfect life. And I think that's what's interesting in Foursquare, is that Foursquare is very keen to try and establish community relationship and engagement and dialogue. And so avoid the kind of narcissistic inward reflection and trying to encourage outward engagement, because that's ultimately what makes the milieu, if you like, centrifugal. If it becomes a narcissistic representation, then it's at risk of not expanding. Yeah, because individuals ultimately decide this is no fun, I'm going to stop doing it. And so they really emphasize this idea of the milieu and having fun. And so yes, there is that competition.
Oops, sorry. So, sorry, Chris, you're muted. Can you unmute? Here you go.
I've unmuted myself.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry about this. I was about to take another round of questions now, and I know that you're a talker, so that was the quickest way to shut you up. No,
fair enough.
that was a mistake on my side. So we have a question from Min Min Chi, and Min Min, go ahead.
Hi, Min Min.
Hi. Thank you for taking the question. I guess it probably Chris along talking going on. Probably I get some idea, and then probably can just talk at a later stage.
Okay, perfect. Then I have another question. That will be Charlene Lee.
Oh, hi.
Hi there.
Yeah, I think I'm not very familiar with control and literature, but I have taken some AI kind of courses. Mm-hmm. So from what you said, it's very much like encourage people to collect data for certain super managed level, and then they could apply certain algorithm based on personal information, and then encourage them, or even just apply certain way to enhance the probability of people to behave certain way based on their utility or any other incentive schemes. And is this something more like artificial intelligence applied in human beings?
I think that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that one. And I guess it's the nature of any kind of theorization is that it's incomplete. And so in choosing to try and focus ourselves on seduction, we're trying to draw particular attention to aspects of community and symbolic exchange. But of course, if you look at Facebook employs a lot of behavioral scientists. And Facebook is spending a long time, but I imagine much more either just, if you like, Dust Bowl empirically driven or psychologically informed, theorizing that if we present information to users in particular ways, can we persuade them to click more on adverts so that we can sell stuff? But I think that kind of approach to control tends to be much more about the individual, their psychological preferences or economic theory about how, if you like, individuals can be motivated by presentation of data. So I think that's if you like, it's a much more individual level analysis would be my understanding. Those are relevant for sure and interesting issues, but they're not quite where we're aiming. We're trying to draw out these other aspects of control, which would be more about community and fun. Because ultimately, I'm not sure, Facebook, when it's doing its behavioral analysis, cares whether the user's having fun. I think they care that they click on the ad.
So,
and they're interested in behavioral nudges to make that happen.
Maybe just adding on this. So the point of Charlene, I think, is really interesting with regard also, because you're talking about communities and community, people having fun to interact in the community. But if I get her question correctly, then it might be that the community consists of, agents, artificial intelligence agents, and you're actually interacting with the pseudo community and not really with the community. But that was just my 2 cents. So we have another question from Rodrigo Zuza. Rodrigo.
Can I just quickly, because okay, thank you for clarifying. I'm sorry for not having caught that in the original question. But I think actually a very important part of, if you like, of what's going on is about community engagement and the if you like, the fact that the people you're engaging with. So I think, if you look at platforms like TripAdvisor, there's a lot of concern that you've got fake reviews or bot-driven reviews. But the notion of community is very different. Foursquare is trying to encourage people in symbolic exchange, very often with people they know, and to get them to encourage people that they know to join in. And so if you like, I think the space for a bot to creep into that is more limited because, the idea is that I'm creating connections with the people I compete with. So it seems less likely that I'm more likely, therefore, to want to compete with people I know.
Let's see. Okay, thanks. Rodrigo.
Hi, Chris. I was wondering, given that ethnography means that you become part of a community and a tribe and you become an insider, how does ethnography accomplish that? Because have you signed up for Foursquare and then start to use, or how have you immersed yourself in this environment and at the same time didn't become addicted to it? So reflexivity, how have you...
Okay, so it's a couple of good questions there. And I think the first one, I think the word ethnography doesn't have the same degree of weight, at least in my mind, methodology, as ethnography. And so I think absolutely ethnography coming out of anthropology very much is about, actually living in the community. And so I'm always slightly nervous in accounting when people say they're doing an ethnography, because I think it's quite rare you see studies with the degree of fieldwork that strike me as suitable to, if you like, justify that kind of claim. So in my own papers, I always say I'm doing a longitudinal field study because I think ethnography is a very big claim. And so when we deal with netnography, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there's a legitimation claim to try and imagine we can get some reflected glory, but I would tend to see it as a convenient way of describing the empirical location of the data sources that we use. But if you look at qualitative research, the idea that we might read, if you like, documents from the field is well established. So maybe it's just trendy. I don't know. I would be interested. I mean, we've got David in the audience. We've got Chris in the audience, who've both done ethnographies. Have I just been saying appalling travesties of the truth, or do you see things the same?
We also have Ingrid Jäckle in the audience, and she has a question directly related to that. So Ingrid. Ingrid, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, I couldn't get it working. Chris, thank you. So interesting to listen. One of the issues that when I'm talking to I do a little session with our PhD students on netnography, and one of the issues that keeps coming up all the time is these ethical issues. So, Cozy Nets, the marketing netnography guru, is very, very strong on these ethical issues about disclosing yourself, that you're doing this type of research. And then I think back to when we did our TripAdvisor, and we would didn't think of anything like that. We just observed the site and observed viewers' comments. So
yeah, no, Ingrid, I think this, you know, as you say, the active side of things would be if we actually signed up and tried to become super users and were engaging with other people on the site, pretending we were super users when actually we were trying to do a research project. Is that the kind of, I think that's, and so no, we aren't, you know, I'm not signed up for Foursquare. I'm not actually signed up for any social media. You know, so maybe, actually, I don't know, maybe we were being opportunistically trendy in trying to use the word ethnography, and we should just say we used published archival data.
no, I think it is ethnography. Yeah, it's just I guess
Jesus Christ is my nigga.
there's a
Oh, wonderful.
in terms.
So I wrote this song for the Christian youth. I want to teach kids.
Oh, sorry.
Everybody mute. So.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Anyway, great.
Stop muting me. Stop.
Where is this person?
It's okay, I kicked him out.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so back to the questions, and apologies for this. You know, an open platform, then this can happen. So we have a question from Marco Trombetta.
I can read it here. I don't know if everyone else can read it. Marco, if you want to say it, so that
I'm here. Hi, Chris. Good to see you.
Hi. Good to see you again.
I'm just trying to thinking. I mean, isn't it really still a market exchange in a way? Okay, we are getting for free things that we used to pay for before. Okay, to be part of a club or to have fun and to become the leader of your club, you had to somehow pay for being part of that. And now you are paying by simply giving away money that you should get out of your data. Okay, so maybe the only thing is that this is happening now in a covered way. Okay, where before it was much more clear. I just paid and I got what I paid for. Now it's more subtle, and maybe there is a lot of mass exploitation going on. Okay, but it's still market exchange in the good old way, in a way. What do you think?
Okay, I mean, in some senses, I'm all for horses for courses, and people, you know, people debate and see things in ways that are useful to them according to the resources and interests they've got. So yeah, you could conceptualize it as a market exchange. I guess we would see ourselves as kind of trying to draw out the social aspects of that. Because when we say market exchange, I guess you're shorthanding when you say traditional, as we've already done, a whole bunch of ancillary assumptions about the nature of what is going on and how people think about things. So I'm always very struck. A few years ago in the UK now, actually probably more years ago than I care to remember, Jeremy Sandell from Harvard gave the Reith lectures about the morals of markets. And the point of his lecture was to show the fact that actually markets are in fact not a neutral activity. How we choose to frame things changes the nature and meaning of what's going on. And one of the most compelling examples he gave, I thought, was this idea that when you look at late fees for nursery pickups, this actually turns out to change the nature of what people think is going on. So you've got childcare, and obviously if parents turn up late because they're busy, it's inconvenient. And so there was some studies done that said, well, why don't we just introduce a fee? Because that would produce a market mechanism that would make parents, if you like, behave and not turn up late. But what actually happened was that a whole bunch of people suddenly saw this as a fee for service. And so it actually increased late attendances. And so you have very different, if you like, social resonances about what does this market transaction mean? Is it a punishment and an attempt to disincentive, or is it an offer of service? And so I think, I kind of get where you're coming from, but I guess we're trying to move into the opening out of the social realm about what's going on in these situations, rather than sort of zeroing in or assuming that the kind of standard framing of economic theory, is all that's going on. This doesn't deny that this is also a way of theorizing it. Don't know if that gives something like an answer.
Okay, thanks. So let me see where we get additional questions here that I missed. No, I think we're good.
Oh, Michael Sandell, sorry. Yeah.
So
Jeremy? Michael, okay. So.
Okay, wonderful. So then, Chris, you can continue, and we're gonna have one last round of questions, maybe 10 minutes to 5 or something. Roundabout.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm on good track because I've got 18 slides, so it feels like
wonderful. Very good. I'm impressed.
So it feels like we're going well.
Okay.
And so maybe, Marco, this is part of what we want to bring out about the fact that whilst you can conceptualize it and analyze it as a market transaction, we think Foursquare and the community are keen to kind of make sure there is a conversation around what's going on that actually is kind of more about this being a responsibility than a fee for service for being late kind of example. And so, part of what they're doing, as you say, you could conceptualize as, people are in a market of exchange of information where they find stuff and they provide it to others. But they're very keen to encourage, and I think this also goes back to the nature of the kind of earlier question about AI bots. In some senses, they're keen to emphasize the personal and the interactive. I mean, I guess it's conceivable that Rasmus is a bot, but for Rasmus to be a bot, they would also have to have a social media presence in which they're doing check-ins, and because there are photos. So it just feels that, there's at least an attempt to provide an anchor around people in the digitized space that give less space for kind of bots to be taking over. And so here we see it's supposed to be about giving an exchange and welcoming of strangers, which again is about, ultimately Foursquare's rather utilitarian desire, the fact that the more people who engage in this, the more data they have and the more valuable it becomes. But in order to get that data, they do need to create, if you like, a satisfying symbolic milieu in which people are not, if you like, hopefully narcissistically collapsing into anxiety about whether they are super user number 10 or number 50. So I'm just looking at a question. I shouldn't be looking at a question. So this altruism, gift giving, welcoming of strangers, we think there's lots of aspects about the way Foursquare, if you like, curates its milieu that is relevant to the notion of kind of society. But then we do get to the kind of the money side of things. And the location-based input data for attribution, and attribution is one of the services that Foursquare offers to its actual customers, the people who pay them. And they're basically providing them information, and so they actually swap geolocation data with Uber. So Uber buys their location data, they sell it back to them. There's this circulating going on, but also then there is more direct data that's being used to quantify media impact, analyze audience characteristics. So these third-party service providers where the material exchanges are going on with Foursquare users, the material that Foursquare has valuable to help them do that. And so this is the kind of the money side of things where all the material exchange is going on, but we really see this kind of three-legged stool, if you like, where the exchanges between Foursquare and Foursquare users and each other is very much in the symbolic realm, and they're trying very hard to make sure it's a symbolic realm of play more than anxiety. But then there is a material realm, and that's also involving the three parties, but in a different circuit. And so Foursquare is selling user data to customers, but also, of course, that the customers ultimately, to some extent, have to believe that Foursquare users are within their target market. And so this is where you start to see the fact that, the symbolic realm and the material realm are not entirely separated, which is part of why we are hoping that actually Baudrillard and Foucault can complement each other. Because whilst there is space in the symbolic realm for some stuff that really has no material interaction, and so, the extreme example we have, that is the user who checks into a ditch. And ultimately the ditch is taken away as a location. But the point is, if that provided a motivational input or energy or a fun story for them to share with their other people, then Foursquare is laissez-faire. Foursquare is, in Foucault's sense of the biopath, doesn't mind what people do as long as a proportion of it is, if you like, relatable to material exchanges going on somewhere else. And so, as I say, whilst I think theoretically Baudrillard, the symbolic and the material should be really sort of separated, because in his mind, the only thing that really matters is the material, that's the symbolic. I think when we look at the Foursquare setting, we see a control environment in which it's the careful orchestration of these symbolic and these material flows that's what's driving things. And so we try and produce this diagram to kind of document this rather complex nature of what's going on. So in terms of trying to draw to a kind of conclusion here and then leave just a little space for any kind of final questions, our argument, I guess, boils down to the fact that Foursquare is engaged in an extensive and purposeful process of symbolic exchange with users. And this, I think, is the kind of half of the control story. This is them doing this, of course, in exchange for the data and the diversity and the activity that it produces. And they need it to be fun in order to sustain the idea of centrifugal. If it was just an anxiety machine, or at least if it was only an anxiety machine, because of course we can't deny the possibility that there will be Foursquare users who are anxious and who are nervous about their representation of self in a more traditional disciplinary understanding of things. But our point is not to say that Foursquare is only fun, but to use Foursquare as an environment to draw out theoretically that control or seduction has some traction and interest for us to explore further. And so that's what's going on. And a part of the way Foursquare tries to skew the balance, if you like, away from anxiety and towards fun is that there are many different games to win. You know, they're not creating a unilateral hierarchy. And I think this is one of the things that when we go to more traditional control settings, ultimately is where the problems become with the control practice of having a leaderboard, you know, is a classic control system. But in many commercial settings, of course, the leaderboard is then normally fairly tightly controlled to either wages or promotion prospects. And so, you know, if you like, the symbolic potential of the leaderboard as a medium of exchange between users is somewhat overshadowed by the material potential of it to say things about what your money, your wages might look like in future. And so the symbolic aspect of gamification is why the Foursquare bioverse might be expanding. And so that was ultimately the question that Baudrillard put back to Foucault, which is, I understand discipline and biopower, but if that's all there is, why? And so seduction, we hope, is an extra sort of jigsaw puzzle piece that helps us respond to that. And in terms of diversity, Foursquare ultimately is very much only concerned at the level of the population. It doesn't really mind if individuals choose to only ever check in at coffee shops, as long as across the population, there is a range of things going on. So the process is centrifugal, expanding, becoming more complex, but not by virtue of a process of individual anxiety and normalization, rather a sense of community, pleasure, and seduction. So I think this linkage is important, and I think this is where Foursquare, if you like, is different from these other settings, because they, you know, the low stakes, they give of their time and effort to produce this data because notionally they're having fun. But in other platform organizations, the material is, if you like, a bigger shadow on things. You know, the Uber driver is worried about the performance review they get. The Uber rider is worried about the performance review they get. And so because they actually materially affect their prospects of access to resources that they care about, the ability to either provide a service or to get a taxi. And so it is this offsetting of the symbolic and the commodity that makes things work. Final slide, just to wrap things up. Of course, we have to kind of take on the chin that we've done an ethnography that has accessed documentary materials, but of course we have to acknowledge that many of these materials, if not most, are published by Foursquare. And so inevitably, of course, the documents are going to be biased towards more fun stories, more positive aspects of what's going on. And that, you know, they won't be telling the stories about the Foursquare users who had mental breakdowns because they were overly anxious about whatever. But having taken on the chin, you know, the nature of the access we have to this published material is driven by Foursquare. We hope that even with that potential bias, given that we're not claiming that this is a universal or even universal in Foursquare, but we're hoping it is an empirically useful setting to tease out the possibilities and the potential of theorizing control with seduction in this new way. And I guess that's kind of where we're going. So at that point, that was everything I particularly wanted to get through on my slides. So we've got a little bit of time for anything else, or we can just rush straight to the reception, and you can tease me there.
No, not that fast. Not that fast, Chris. So we do have some questions. So let me start with Mark. Mark Klepperby has a question.
Hi, Chris. I just wondered to what extent you're looking at this from the perspective of the firm, and I wondered to what extent the marketing literature recognizes notions of control. I see some of the references you have in the paper of from this literature, but it seems, to what extent is this being picked up from the sort of customer side? The idea that susceptibility to seduction might be driving your customer base.
The marketing literature, in some senses, were first off the block on gamification, and very much they see it as a marketing tool. And so there is literature on that. But in earlier versions of the paper, I hope it's not a question that's, if you like, hanging in too many people's minds after this version of the paper. But some people have said, why should I believe this is control and not marketing? And for my money, that's why we've tried to really draw out the fact that, well, this is not Foursquare selling stuff. This is Foursquare, if you like, generating labor that is commercially valuable for it. And so for me, that puts it into the realm of control. It could be marketing as well. There are no doubt marketing aspects to be drawn out, and there is a literature on that. But in some senses, what our task, as we've tried to set it for ourselves, is to elaborate what's the control side of this.
Yeah, I didn't think that it wasn't intended to sort of to dismiss it. It's just interesting territory and relatively underexplored, isn't it? Control and marketing, or from the accounting side, anyway.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, in some ways, if I look at the marketing literature, there's a lot of things with my management accounting hat on that I'm kind of annoyed they do more of than we do. So I think if you look at customer profitability analysis, the marketing literature, I think there's quite a lot of studies of it. With my activity-based costing hat on, I would be somewhat sniffy about the quality of some of that work, but at least they're trying. Whereas in management accounting, you really don't see a lot of customer profitability analysis work. I think if you look at yield management and pricing, again, those are literatures that are quite rich in the marketing area that I don't think we have a great deal of in the management accounting literature. So yeah, I think it's always interesting to look in these other literatures. So.
Thanks.
Maybe a little bit related to that, I was wondering when about generalizability, obviously, and you brought Uber as an example. Now, I personally had this feeling that Uber is not really a well-fitting example because Uber is a different type of platform. And I like
the point I was trying to make.
Sorry, I liked your statement, Chris, that you said that you view let's say, the participants of the Foursquare game more like labor, people that actually provide labor. And so what kind of business models do you have in mind to which the Foursquare example could be good for generalizability?
I mean, I think in some senses, and this speaks to the question that's kind of now next up in our mind is about, well, okay, it's all very well to say that seduction is interesting and we can see it in Foursquare, but if it's to go much further as a way of conceptualizing control, we have to be able to think about it in, if you like, other settings than just Foursquare, if even other platform organizations aren't doing it. And so off the top of my head, I think some of the issues that I think would be interesting to start to explore in a more traditional control setting would be how we think about the control of creative processes and how we think about the control of teams, particularly. Because I think teams would be a good example where, if you like, it's not as easy to simply disentangle things to a simple hierarchy because different team members do different things. And so when we're dealing with a team, the leaderboard, in terms of providing a nice unified, unidimensional hierarchy of performance, is not helpful for us. And so what we need is to find ways to get the team members to creatively interact with each other. And I think those would be settings in which gamification, it's of course not that in a team setting there won't be performance evaluation, but that might be happening at a sufficiently later stage that, if you like, there's enough space for this symbolic engagement to keep the energy, the momentum, the activity going for wherever the material and production efficiency evaluations are happening, to then come in later without having squashed too much the potential for gamification to generate this more fun thing, as opposed to just being an opportunity for me to be nervous about what my boss will do in my performance review in 6 months. So I think right now, off the top of my head, I think rather than business models, I'm more interested in trying to see how can we think about it in control contexts.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question by Marco, and just for the record, Charles agrees with the question. Marco.
And it is Charles Cho, okay?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go back a little bit and play devil's advocate or the cynic part, okay? But What I typed is, aren't they really killing us softly with their game in a way? Meaning, oh, it's all nice. We are all a part of a nice community. At the end of the day, it's all about the race for data and the economic exploitation of this data. And suddenly I am part of a mechanism that eventually exploits a cyclist driver that for £2 kills himself or herself on a road to deliver food to my door. Okay, and so I totally agree there is a form for control. I'm not so sure that we should be so gentle about the interpretation. Okay, and it seems like we are all happy to be part of this happy family and taking part of this, and it's a little bit more dangerous than that. Okay, so
oh, Marco, I think that's a really good question, and I don't really disagree with you. I think there's a question about what we do with that. I mean, if we want, I mean, I think one thing we have to be very careful about, and we discussed this in the author team a lot, is that here we are, if you like, to some extent limited by the fact that we've undertaken an ethnography. So all we have is published material. We haven't been to speak to these people, to spend time with them. And so in some senses, I don't think we're in a position to adjudicate, are they really having fun or not? And even if we went to spend time with them, I think it's kind of risky. And if you look at some of the people in the literature, sort of Thrift, for example, and his non-representational theory and sort of thinking about emotional engineering, I think he's much more with you about the kind of cynicism of this emotional manipulation and the inauthenticity of experiences that are thereby generated. And so I'm sensitive to the kind of the negative potential that you're highlighting, but I'm also sensitive to the risking to be a bit superior and saying, well, look, you may think you're having fun, but I know the real story, and actually you're just a dupe and being manipulated and you're not having fun. And so, of course, I think the real story is somewhere in the middle.
I agree.
I think the issue here is, ultimately, it's not our job to adjudicate whether Foursquare is manipulative. In some senses, it's a control agenda, and so, of course, they are manipulative. But what we're trying to do is bring in more of a sense of reciprocity and exchange that Baudrillard wants us to have. And so it's not an exercise of altruism by Foursquare. But in it being an exercise of control, it is, if you like, endeavoring much more than traditional forms of control to give the user a stake in directing and changing and enjoying what's going on. And so even if that is only limited, it strikes us as still, if you like, conceptually quite different to more traditional disciplinary notions of control.
Thank you.
We have a next question from Paulo Roberto da Cunha. Paulo. Where is he?
Oh, that's a big question to finish with.
So I asked to unmute. I asked him to unmute. Maybe you want to unmute, but I think it is a big question. So let me read it out then. So what is the ethical concern about using this data for manipulation, intensifying unconscious controls? What is the implication of these controls for economic exploitation? I'm interested.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, there's a lot of big stuff there. Let me have a go. I think this is one of the ones where ultimately I'm going to maybe slightly pass the buck. In terms of, we've only done an ethnography. And I think this is, if we do our job right in saying that this is an important aspect of what's going on, the obvious next thing to do is actually to get closer to the field and the participants to understand this more. Because in some senses, we're not in a good position based on an ethnography to know what is in their unconscious or even their conscious. But I do think it's important, and I'm very nervous about, or maybe put it more positively than I'm nervous. I am intrigued about the potential for social change in our attitudes about what we think is important. And so let me try and give you an example. In the context of the internet, there's a big debate about privacy. And so, it's this hidden secret. By engaging in social media and accessing these free services, the argument is if you can't see the product, you are the product. And I think different people have very different attitudes to what that means. And so I think there's a kind of emerging stream in management control looking at how do you do performance evaluation and motivation for Generation Z individuals? Because potentially they think about things very differently. And one of those things I think is undoubtedly privacy. And I think it's complicated to, if you like, superimpose a perspective from one particular viewpoint about what privacy is and why it's important on a different group of individuals who may or may not think about it differently. And so I think, this is why for me, I have, I'm hoping we can spend some more time and we can actually go to the field and study some of these things. But I think a kind of tighter or simpler example, just to make that point about this, the social meaning being fluid, if I go out for dinner with someone and they spend their time at the dinner and they are texting someone else, my general interpretation is that this is quite rude behavior. Yeah, because you think, well, okay, I'm here. Why are you spending time messaging someone else who's not here? But I think there's a number of studies emerging about sort of Generation Z individuals where if they would turn that on its head, and it would be rude not to include participants who weren't able to be physically there. And so I think this kind of unconscious controls and exploitation are complex words where the social context is actually shifting. And I think particularly in the context of a game where it is voluntary, I think Uber is more complicated because Uber drivers are ostensibly dependent on Uber quite potentially for their ability to pay their rent. Foursquare users, not so much. And so I think there's a range of issues here, but I guess I'm going to end up saying, I think those are such big questions that what we really need is lots more field work. Yeah.
Yeah, a good way to answer that question, I guess. So I'm looking into the chat and I'm wondering whether we have another round of questions. So somebody who acts quick could jump in. Otherwise, I just want to maybe just give a little spin on this last question, because when I read it, I also thought about the discussions that we have around nudging in general ways. So, the problem that certain agents just behave in a way that subconsciously nudges people into certain behaviors. And I really wonder whether what we are seeing here at a larger scale is basically a shift away from let's say conscious to unconscious control. And of course, the ethical concerns about this, whether this is also something that, say, a democratic government could do or something like this, I think is a big topic. And is this for you something that is entirely different? So this whole debate about nudging, or is this related?
I think that's a helpful clarification question. In kind of shooting at the hip to try and answer one of the earlier attempts at that question, I'm not sure I did such a clear job. And so I guess an issue here that I think is important about the nature of theorizing seduction, as Baudrillard puts it, is that this is not an unconscious activity. Mm. This is a conscious engagement with the community. And it is about one-upmanship and outreach and engagement. And so I think I would see, seduction as control as being fundamentally different from nudging, because as you say, to the extent that nudging is about trying to draw on unconscious bias, seduction in Baudrillard's sense of the word is actually actively about trying to constitute, if you like, consciously and visibly a social engagement. So I think it's not to say that there won't be subconscious processes to that, but it is inherently quite conscious in intent.
Okay, thank you. I learned something. Wonderful. So if there are no other questions, then I have two matter of businesses left. The first is to advertise, the very first is to thank Chris for his presentation and, to give him a virtual round of applause. I think it was very interesting. We all learned a lot. And everybody who's a Foursquare customer can now rethink his strategy or her strategy on Foursquare. Then the second thing will be to announce next week's seminar. Next week's seminar is by Christine Cooper from University of Edinburgh. And it's the title is Agencyfication, Replacing Liberal Democracy with Neoliberal Accountability. Again, a paper with complex words, I'd say. We are very much looking forward to having you all here. Don't forget to register. To the PhD students out there and the junior or assistant professors, the meeting slots are also a great way to get in contact with the speaker. And I think it's helpful. So, and it's first come, first served. So if you're interested in getting a meeting slot with Christine, just check back over the weekend maybe and register your interest, because normally Monday, Tuesday, they basically run out. Okay, and last thing, virtual reception, as indicated. If you still have time and want to chat about the paper or Foursquare or what else, consider joining us. So the link is on the webpage. I think you just have to click and you get the access code and you can enter the virtual reception. So this is it from my side. I'm wondering whether I forgot something. I hope not. To everybody who's not making it to the virtual reception, enjoy the weekend, do some accounting research, or just hang out with friends or whatever. Okay, thanks. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Nice
See you next
weekend.
week.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Wonderful. So I guess my job is to leave and open up the virtual reception, right? I see you guys in a sec.
Okay,
bye.
Thank you.